All right. Well, welcome everyone to our second week of virtual collaborative online interactive learning sessions between scholars in the United States and in Pakistan as part of the Fulbright program. So today's session is going to focus on inequality in American history, and we are honored to have two professors. The lecturer which will be Clement Fatovic, and we also have Professor Dayyab Gillani from University of the Punjab. So I'll introduce Professor Fatovic first. Dr. Fatovic's primary research and teaching interests are in modern and contemporary political and constitutional theory, including American political thought, democratic theory, and executive power. His research focuses primarily on the development of liberalism and modern constitutionalism in 17th and 18th century political thought, especially at the American founding. His work has explored political thinkers such as John Locke, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, among others. He's interested in the relevance of their ideas to current debates over the tensions between emergency powers and the rule of law, things like inequality as well. So his articles, he's published numerous articles and books. His first book was entitled Outside the Law, Emergency and Executive Power by Johns Hopkins University Press. He has another book that he co-edited, Extra Legal Power and Legitimacy, Perspectives on Prerogative, and in the current book on inequality that he's going to be talking about today. His articles have appeared in numerous journals, including American Journal of Political Science, Perspectives on Politics, History of Political Thought, Journal of the History of Ideas, American Political Thought, and the Maryland Law Review, and the Good Society. So he's a wonderful scholar of American history, and we're honored to have him today to talk a little bit about his perspectives. And then we will introduce Professor Gillani for the discussant role. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Fatovic.
Well, thank you everyone for attending, and thanks especially to Dr. Akhtar for the very kind invitation, and also for those very generous remarks at the opening. So the topic here is one that Dr. Akhtar had asked me to address, and even though the book that he mentioned is that I wrote focuses on economic inequality, I'm going to be discussing various forms of inequality in American history more generally, from the founding, by which I mean that period starting with the American Revolution and continuing through the establishment of the American Constitution. And again, I'll be looking at various aspects of inequality throughout American history. So even before there was the United States, America had a reputation not just as a land of freedom, but as a place of equality. When British colonists compared America to the rest of Europe, they saw a place that promised far greater economic equality of opportunity for settlers than anything that was possible in the old world. And in places such as Rhode Island, greater equality of religion than anything possible, except in a small handful of places in Europe. In fact, the reputation that America would establish for equality in various areas of social, political, and religious life would always be based, at least in part, on favorable comparisons to Europe and the rest of the world. The ideas that grew out of the American Revolution would only strengthen and deepen support for the idea of equality. The revolution gave rise to theories that repudiated the legitimacy of hereditary forms of privilege and pronounced the natural equality of individuals. The bold assertion in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, all men are created equal, is just the most famous statement of a creed that was endorsed by many other prominent figures besides Jefferson. The idea of equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and other revolutionary documents would inspire proposals to abolish legal privileges for wealth, to reduce or eliminate property qualifications for voting and holding office, to establish greater equality among members of different religions, and even to abolish the most obvious form of inequality in the new country, slavery, which I'll talk about later. Now, the idea that America is a country that not only celebrates the idea of equality, but that it generally lives up to that ideal, is a vital component of what's called the myth of American exceptionalism. And this is basically the idea that America is somehow special or unique among nations. An idea that's really preposterous because every nation is unique or special in its own way, but there's an idea that continues to hold great sway in the United States among many Americans and political leaders. Of course, the reality differs from the myth. No sooner had Americans established new forms of democratic self-governance and egalitarian policies in the newly independent states than leading politicians started questioning the extension of freedom and equality to the so-called masses. Prominent figures such as Gouverneur Morris, who was the drafter of the Constitution, James Madison, who's sometimes called the father of the Constitution for the ideas that he put forth in there, and John Adams, who became second president of the United States, all began to worry that the rise of the lower orders, they variously described as ignorant masses, a mob, poor reptiles, and scum would take over. Moreover, some of the egalitarian reforms that were adopted in the wake of the American Revolution faced serious backlash from wealthy property owners and political elites, including George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, all of whom called for changes that would have the effect of increasing disparities between different groups at the state and national levels. Indeed, the creation of the US Constitution represented a victory for those who wanted to slow down and even reverse the pace of egalitarian change. As many scholars have noted, the Constitution was not a triumph of democracy. It was an attempt to constrain democracy, including some of those egalitarian impulses that I'd mentioned. And this brings me to the central point I'd like to make today. Equality in the United States, both as an ideal and in practice, has always been contested, has always been fragile, and has always been applied unevenly. Even as some groups achieve recognition and win access to offices and opportunities that have been denied to others, other groups have faced setbacks and reversals. My argument is not just that there's always been a mismatch between the ideal and the reality of equality. There's always a mismatch between theory and practice. My larger point is that the very meaning of equality and how it gets applied in practice has changed over time in ways that challenge any optimistic ideas of steady and inevitable progress, right? That's the sort of idea that many people still have in the United States, that right, there's a sort of steady march of progress, including greater equality and greater freedom over time. But like any enduring myth, the myth of American exceptionalism does have some kernels of truth that have worked to sustain and reconfigure ideas about equality. In other words, if it were totally a sham, it wouldn't hold up over time. And there are some things that help keep this idea going. And what follows, I'll offer some brief accounts of how equality became an ideal in America, and then I'll discuss examples of how inequality has persisted in the areas of race, religion, class, and politics throughout the history of the country. So first, let me begin by saying a little bit about the founding. As I suggested in my opening remarks, the American colonies generally practiced and endorsed a greater commitment to equality than the countries that sent settlers there. And reflecting on the origins and nature of American democracy that he witnessed firsthand when he arrived to the United States in the 1830s, the French political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville noted that democracy in America, which was also the title of his famous book, had to be understood in terms of the egalitarian character of social and economic life that exists in America from the start, at least compared to Europe. Right? So basically, Tocqueville suggests that America was always democratic in spirit because of the kinds of socioeconomic conditions that prevailed. He wrote, "Among the new objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, none struck my eye more vividly than the equality of conditions. I discovered without difficulty the enormous influence that this primary fact exerts on the course of society. It gives a certain direction to public spirit, a certain turn to the laws, new maxims to those who govern, and particular habits to the governed," end quote. So Tocqueville, again, was not claiming that Americans were in fact equal to each other in terms of their wealth or income. He used the term equality of conditions to refer to the fact that compared to European countries that still maintained vestiges of feudalism well into the 19th century, socioeconomic status in the United States was not fixed or codified into law, with some obvious exceptions that I'll mention. There were wealthy individuals, but they could not depend on the government to prop them up forever. There were poor individuals, but they did not face any legal impediments to moving up. In Tocqueville's view, the relative absence of feudalistic laws and institutions resulted in a greater degree of socioeconomic openness that he described as democratic and egalitarian. Thus, relations between members of different classes, between the clergy and the laity, between governors and governed, and even between men and women were already relatively equal. And Tocqueville believed were likely to become even more so. Of course, Tocqueville's account is plausible only if you ignore the presence of slavery and racial inequality, which he did in much of his book. Now, if Tocqueville locates the egalitarian spirit of Americans in the habits and mores they developed in everyday life, the egalitarian principles of Americans could be located in the ideals promulgated during the American Revolution. The revolution gave rise to new ideas and theories that repudiated the legitimacy of hereditary forms of privilege and pronounced the natural equality of individuals. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is best known for inspiring British colonists to finally break with the empire and establish an independent state. But just as important in Paine's book was his scathing attack on hereditary privilege and hereditary government. For instance, he famously and quite amusingly denounced monarchy and the worthlessness of kings by saying royalty couldn't possibly be ordained by nature or ordained by God, since so often an ass was made to serve as a lion. There are other quotes I could mention, but I'll save those. And as I mentioned, the Declaration of Independence led many Americans to believe that inequalities protected by law were offensive because they violated the natural rights of individuals. But those ideals were also articulated in a host of pamphlets, speeches, and sermons that were widely circulated during the war. Even more important to American identity ideals than equality is the idea of freedom. However, 18th century beliefs about freedom grounded in natural and inalienable rights meant that freedom is always or was always linked to equality. So if there is a natural right to freedom of conscience or a natural right to freedom of speech, such rights belong to everyone on an equal basis without distinction, at least in theory. Now, Jefferson himself, who is a very complicated figure here, put some of these ideas into practice by helping to eliminate feudal laws of entail and primogeniture that basically ensured that estates would continue in the hands of the eldest heirs, and to eliminate state establishments of religion that created separate classes on the basis of religion. When asked in his retirement about the meaning of the term republic, which many people in the second and third generation of the United States were wondering about, he defined its hallmark as equal rights among citizens, an idea that was steadfastly opposed to all hereditary privileges. And the idea of equality under the law for all citizens would continue to be a hallmark of American principles. But another idea has probably been even more influential in shaping American ideals and impacting immigration to the United States. And I'm speaking here about the ideas of equal opportunity and upward mobility, which are very closely linked and are an important part of the myth of American exceptionalism that I've mentioned. The idea that anyone can come to the United States and with hard work and effort climb the economic ladder to secure a comfortable life and even strike it rich has been a defining feature of American politics and culture up to the present. The idea has been sustained for centuries by real life rags to riches stories, including Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Carnegie, and more recently, people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. In the 19th century, the writer Horatio Alger published the rags to riches idea that numerous novels geared towards boys, published numerous books that were geared towards boys to inspire them to get ahead. So in the 18th century, the 19th century, this idea about promoting upward mobility was actually put into practice through the institution of a broad-based and free public education, right? This began in New England and continued through the rest of the country at a time when the US was one of the only places in the world doing this sort of thing. Now, as I've suggested, these ideas don't necessarily always match reality. Even worse, these ideas have not always been endorsed across all areas. And here I'll turn to some specific issues that I mentioned. First, looking at racial inequality. So relations between the perceived races, especially those between blacks and whites, have historically represented the most extreme forms of inequality and the most serious departure from stated commitments to the ideal of equality in the United States. While like every other area of inequality in the US, the story here is one of uneven development and fragile games that have often been negated and reversed. Now, race-based forms of chattel slavery existed in each of the original 13 colonies that separated from Great Britain. However, the egalitarian rhetoric that infused revolutionary political thought did call some prominent figures to challenge slavery as an institution that was obviously incompatible with the stirring words of the Declaration of Independence. But others took those ideas seriously and began to challenge both slavery and racial inferiority. Unlike Jefferson, who took very few concrete actions to end slavery, others joined anti-slavery associations, like Ben Franklin, and also submitted petitions to Congress to abolish slavery. However, like Jefferson, Americans, with few exceptions, shared his belief in the natural inferiority of blacks, which Jefferson described as a difference fixed in nature. So despite some urging to end slavery, the idea of racial animosity and hostility and hierarchy persisted and continues to persist. Now, during the founding, many Americans, including Jefferson, thought the whole issue of racial inequality would go away because they expected slavery to become obsolete. They thought economic changes would eventually render it anachronistic. Pennsylvania became the first state in 1780 to make slavery outlawed. Other states in New England, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut soon followed. Despite some of the Revolutionary era changes, the Constitution, as I mentioned, marked a retreat from any movement in the direction of racial equality by establishing various protections for slavery, even though the term itself was carefully avoided. Technological and economic changes that most directly affected agriculture in the South of the country maintained support for what was called the peculiar institution, where many founders, including those who owned slaves, were embarrassed by an institution they could only defend as a necessary evil. By the 1830s, things changed, where politicians and writers in places such as Virginia and South Carolina started to describe slavery as a positive blessing and reinforce beliefs in racial differences between Blacks and whites. So you see an increase in extraordinarily racist ideas, kind of more complex, deeply rooted racist ideas actually continuing through the 19th century. But the slaveholding South was not alone in maintaining racial hierarchy. Right, there's this impression, especially if you have a passing knowledge about the antebellum period in the United States, that the South was where slavery persisted, but of course it extended throughout the whole country. Most states in the North actually restricted the vote to whites after the year 1800. For example, the 1821 State Constitutional Convention in New York imposed a $250 property qualification for Blacks to vote, even though it eliminated all property qualifications for whites. So even as there was an increase in equality, right, between poor and rich white men, you saw the opposite direction when it came to Blacks in places like New York. And even when we're not formally prohibited from voting, custom and legal barriers made it very difficult for free Blacks to exercise that right. Blacks also faced various forms of discrimination outside the realm of politics. Free Blacks were confined to menial occupations and barred from public schools, and there were limits on their freedom of movement. For instance, states Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Oregon barred free Blacks and mulattoes from entering the territory. So free Blacks were not even allowed to step foot on these new states. The end of slavery after the Civil War was by no means the end of racial inequality. Despite some notable victories during the period of Reconstruction immediately after the end of the Civil War, Blacks who were now technically legally free were confronted with basically a kaleidoscopic assortment of discriminatory laws, policies, and practices that kept them in abject forms of second-class citizenship. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination, only days after the end of the Civil War, Southern states began passing Black codes, as they were called, that, among other things, denied Blacks the right to vote, serve on juries, testify in court, buy or sell real estate, and they also excluded Blacks from public schools and apprenticed Black workers to their former owners. So basically, slaves who were just made free were then also forced to work for some of their former owners. The most common and pervasive form of discrimination in everyday laws was used to enforce racial segregation, separating the races in residences, businesses, public accommodations, including restaurants, hotels, hospitals, orphanages, funeral homes, morgues, and cemeteries. So even in death, Blacks and whites wouldn't be able to be side by side. It was not until after the bruising and sometimes bloody fatal struggles of the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s that Blacks throughout the US finally secured some level of equality in housing, employment, voting, and political office holding. The passage of landmark legislation in the mid-1960s has been a watershed moment for Black equality. And so people often point to this period of the so-called Great Society as marking the end of slavery, a kind of, again, a ridiculous notion. But there has been pushback against some of those achievements. Whether it's white hostility to affirmative action in education and employment, protests against the segregation in public schools in the North, or the rise in the politics of white grievance and white racial resentment that has gotten a lot of attention in the United States recently. The identification of several universal social welfare programs with racial minorities, especially during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, has also had the effect of undermining support for policies that would increase economic equality for all groups. So in other words, race gets tied to these programs that would otherwise benefit everyone in ways that end up reducing support overall for these things. Now, despite an avowed commitment to the idea of equality under the law, Blacks to this day face various forms of de facto discrimination that result in unequal treatment by the police, right? The Blacks are more likely to be stopped, arrested, beaten, and killed. Unequal treatment by the courts, where again, Blacks are more likely to be convicted of the same crimes as whites, and more likely to face more serious penalties for committing the same crimes as white defendants. And they face unequal treatment in employment. And there's lots of studies showing that applicants with Black sounding names are much less likely to be interviewed for jobs or get called back. Now, here I'll turn to religious equality. So on the eve of the American Revolution, all colonies but Rhode Island practiced some form of established religion. That is, individuals were required to support an official church of the state or colony, but of their own choosing. For instance, the Church of England was the official religion in 5 southern colonies. Discrimination was practiced against Catholics, Jews, and dissenting Protestants in many places. New York outlawed Roman Catholicism altogether. But as the War for Independence continued, many states abolished or modified their establishments. Those that already had exclusive establishments, saying this was the official religion, liberalized their laws to allow for multiple establishments, basically allowing for a greater number of officially recognized churches that would receive support. And other states that already had multiple establishments moved in the direction of eliminating establishments altogether, or at least making things easier for dissenting Protestants and others. And these ideas would get enshrined in the US Constitution. So unlike race, which gets kind of reinforced, racial hierarchy gets reinforced in the Constitution, religion actually gets liberalized and equalized. First in Article 6, which prohibits religious acts for office. And then this idea was reaffirmed and strengthened by the First Amendment, which forbids establishments of religion. But of course, official declarations and policies are one thing, and actual social practices are another. Right? Despite the stated commitment to religious equality, Roman Catholics continued to face widespread discrimination throughout the 19th century and even into the 20th century. John F. Kennedy's election to the presidency in 1960 was seen as an important moment precisely because it suggested that the dominant Protestant majority was becoming more accepting of those who had formerly been reviled as papists, incapable of becoming true Americans. Mormons have also faced serious social and legal discrimination, not only because their polygamous practices ran afoul of established laws, for other reasons. More recently, Muslims have been the targets of deep-seated hostility, this especially in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Despite George W. Bush's efforts to portray Islam, true Islam, rather, as a religion of peace, many Americans developed deeply bigoted views of Muslims and called for various restrictions on the freedom of ordinary Muslims. At the height of this anti-Muslim hysteria in the United States, lawmakers in some states pursued legislation that would ban Sharia law, as if it was ever a possibility that that would get enacted, restrict the construction of mosques in certain locations. For instance, there was a big controversy over the construction of a facility near what's called Ground Zero, and also impose various burdens on the movements of Muslims. And according to a recent poll, quote, half of US adults say Islam is not part of mainstream American society. And the US public is split over whether there is a natural conflict between Islam and democracy. So despite this celebrated commitment to the idea of equality in religion, despite the fact that there are monuments in Washington, D.C., including at the Jefferson Memorial that testify this idea, we see that in actual practice, things are a little different. And this is the case with sexual equality as well. So the struggles for equality between men and women in the US challenge any notion that the US has been at the forefront of promoting equality. In some areas, the US has boasted that it is ahead of the curve, but when it comes to men and women, it's almost always been behind. Despite the universalistic aspirations of natural rights theories during the revolution, it occurred to almost no one that those ideas should change anything about the status of women. When Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, asked him to, quote, remember the ladies, when he and his colleagues were considering a new government, he jokingly dismissed her notions or concerns. When Thomas Jefferson was later asked about women receiving public education, something he supported for all white men at least, he scoffed at the idea as a fantastical notion that was unworthy of his attention. Right, so literally no prominent American politician during the founding paid any attention to women's issues, with possible exception of Thomas Paine. Other countries have beaten the United States achievements in equality for women. The suffrage movement in the US lagged behind that in Great Britain. Several countries, including Australia, Armenia, New Zealand, Finland, granted women the right to vote before the US did in 1920. Many other countries have altered their constitutions to declare equality among the sexes, but the US has still not ratified the Equal Rights Amendment that was sent to the states for approval in 1972. Many other states have done more to ensure that women receive better representation in government. So I'll give you an example. Women make up just over 50% of the population in the US, but they comprise less than 27% of members in the House of Representatives and just 24% of those in the US Senate. And it was not until 1978 that the first woman was elected rather than appointed to serve in the United States Senate. Over 60 countries by now have had at least one woman serve as president or prime minister, including India, Israel, Portugal, the UK, all of which did that over 40 years ago. To date, no woman has ever served as president of the United States, although Hillary Clinton did win more votes than Donald Trump in the 2016 election. And I'll return to this moment because it shows structural inequalities in the Constitution that are a pervasive problem. Outside of the arena of politics, gender equality has been uneven. So women in the early decades of the 20th century actually made serious inroads into getting PhDs. But as professors started to realize that there was a disparity between the number of PhDs being produced and how many jobs were actually available, they rectified that problem by basically admitting fewer women into PhD programs. So made women bear the brunt of this problem. Although women have now made significant gains in higher education and actually outnumber men in college, both job opportunities and pay continue to lag behind men. Women are underrepresented in the top corporate positions and tenure track job, university jobs, and in the sciences more generally. And on average, women now make about 82% of what men earn. And the reason the US has lagged behind other countries when it comes to equality for women is in part because public opinion has not always been supportive of equality between the sexes. In other words, where there is a sort of the stated commitment to equality among religion, equality in race, again, in theory, public support for this is when it comes to women is very different. When the first Gallup poll in 1937 asked respondents, quote, "Would you vote for a woman for president if she was qualified in every other respect?" 64% said no. The number was even worse when respondents were asked in the year 1940. In that year, 73% said no. Now, the numbers have gone up since then, steadily, but they've never reached 100%. And in the last several years have actually fluctuated, where instead of a steady increase, we've actually seen some reversals, in part because of hostility toward Hillary Clinton and the possibility that a woman would actually become president. Now, I mentioned women's economic gains, and this brings me to economic inequality more generally. And again, I'll try to be brief because I know we're short on time. So when it comes to economic inequality, one might think that disparities in income and wealth don't trouble most Americans because of the country's individualistic and capitalistic mindsets and related ideas about the country being a meritocracy. However, the common assumption that Americans don't care much about economic inequality is actually mistaken. Actual evidence shows that most Americans do care. Why we don't do anything about it is something I'll address momentarily. The problem is that American perceptions about actual levels of economic inequality are wrong. So in other words, Americans express concern, but don't really understand the depth of the problem. There's an awareness of a large and growing gap between those at the very top and everyone else, but Americans terribly underestimate just how serious economic inequality is. Even before the Occupy Wall Street movement of a few years ago drew attention to the gross inequalities that exist, public opinion tended to show that Americans generally had more favorable opinions of the poor than the rich. For instance, polls in 2004 revealed more sympathy and identification with the poor than with the rich, 73% versus 60% approval. Of all groups that respondents were asked to report on, the working class actually scored the highest approval of any group, over 80%. So the group that is most admired is the mythical the working class. And we look at polls about specific policies that would minimize disparities between those at the top and those at the bottom. Majorities of Americans, sometimes very large majorities, have generally expressed support for increasing the minimum wage, raising taxes on the super wealthy, raising taxes on corporations, and a variety of other egalitarian policies. So again, public opinion polls have supported this consistently over the years. Despite these preferences, disparities in wealth and income between those at the top and everyone else have actually grown substantially. Since World War, from World War II until 1979, the US experienced a period that's been called the Great Convergence, a period of enormous economic growth in which the US saw incomes and wealth become much more equal. For instance, just between 1940 and 1950, wage differences shrank by 35%, and the share of income going to the top 10% shrank considerably. And it was during this period, from the end of World War II to 1979, that we saw a robust middle class develop, leading to the possibility of affordable homeownership, affordable college education for most Americans, and this situation where sometimes the top executives of large companies lived in the same neighborhoods as ordinary employees. All that has changed since 1979 during a period that's called the Great Divergence. Inequality in the US now stands at near all-time highs, rivaling levels last seen during the 1920s on the eve of the stock market crash that preceded the Great Depression. So in 1929, the top 1% had between 37 and 44% of all wealth. So estimates are a little hard to come by, but that's the best estimate. Today, the top 1% owns 42% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 60% owns just 1.7%. And according to studies conducted by the OECD, quote, in no other industrial nation does the richest 1% own more than 28% of the country's wealth. Right, and to give just one more example of how extreme things are in the US, the 6 heirs of the Walton family, which made its fortune, with Walmart, the retailer, they own more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans, right? So that one family, right, equals the wealth of the bottom 40% of Americans. And for most of US history, it was actually true that the country ranked first in economic mobility. Again, not looking at outcomes, but whether people could actually rise up. Even though the country never promised equality of outcome, it did preserve genuine equality of opportunity throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. No other country offered you a better chance of rising from the bottom rung of the economic ladder all the way to the top. Now, however, the US provides less mobility than any other industrialized country. The US is now about 30th overall, behind all the Scandinavian countries, Germany, France, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and many others. And the best single predictor of where you end up economically in the United States now is the family you're born into, right? Not your effort, not how much education you get. Those at the bottom tend to stay there, and those at the top are virtually guaranteed to remain there. And these and other disparities in the economic sphere are reinforcing disparities in the political sphere. And this is where I'll conclude my talk. So compared to Europe in the 18th and throughout the 19th centuries, there was far greater political equality in America, despite obvious and persistent restrictions on various forms of political participation, whether at the ballot box, in seeking political office, or serving on juries. Jefferson boasted that political equality was one of the defining and distinctive features of the American system, and future generations sought to preserve the ideal by eliminating barriers to voting, first for white men, then for Black men, then for women in general. Even though there were explicit legal restrictions on voting, there were exceptions. For instance, women with sufficient property in New Jersey were actually allowed to vote in elections until 1807, when men realized there was a mistake to let them vote at all. However, the current rise in economic inequality is contributing to a steep rise in political inequality. As numerous studies over the past 2 decades have documented, public officials are much more responsive to the preferences of the wealthy than they are to those of the middle and lower income voters. The ability of super wealthy individuals to contribute money directly to political campaigns and less directly to specific candidates via spending on commercials, think tank reports, etc., means they have a disproportionate say in what becomes law, and even in what gets placed on the political agenda in the first place. In other words, what gets part of the conversation. The wealthy in the US do participate in politics at higher levels than everyone else, but even when the rich and the rest participate at equal rates, scholars have shown that politicians overwhelmingly side with the rich over everyone else. The best predictor of how a politician votes is how rich constituents feel about a particular issue. In other words, politicians represent income and wealth rather than constituents. That's why support for public funding of education is eroding, why tax cuts since the 1980s have been heavily skewed towards those at the top, and why state taxes that would affect only a tiny fraction of the wealthiest families continue to be slashed. Everyone's wealth in the US, everyone's vote in the US is, of course, not of equal worth. When it comes to electing members of the US Senate, and to a lesser extent the presidency, there are huge disparities between citizens from different states. And this is getting me back to the point about the Constitution and its structural inequalities. Because each state gets 2 senators, regardless of its population size, voters in Wyoming, the smallest state, have 70 times as much influence as residents of California when it comes to the upper house of the US legislature. As a result of this system, 25% of the Senate is elected by just 5% of the national population. And because the presidency is determined by votes in the Electoral College, which is based on a combination of proportional representation and equal votes for the Senate for each state, smaller states, which tend to be much whiter, older, and more rural than the rest of the country, have a disproportionate say in choosing the next president. That's why 2 of the last 4 presidents have reached the White House, even though they have received a minority of votes. And over the course of the country's history, more than half a dozen men have become president, even though they received less than 50% of the popular vote. Inequalities written into the Constitution were also the main reason it's become so difficult to amend the Constitution. Under the supermajority requirements needed to ratify something like the Equal Rights Amendment to achieve gender equality, or amendments that would limit the role of wealthy corporations in US politics, the 13 least populous states can block amendments favored by the rest. So where you live, right, determines how much of a say you have. In addition to the structural barriers to political equality written into the Constitution itself, there are numerous policies that work to disproportionately advantage some citizens and disadvantage others. Not only have Republican-led lawmakers in places such as Florida, Texas, and Georgia made it harder for racial minorities and young people to vote, mainly by establishing discriminatory voter ID laws, but they've also redrawn legislative districts to give Republicans an unfair advantage and Democrats an unfair disadvantage. And because of the racial composition of these parties, it means that Blacks tend to get disadvantaged when it comes to electoral politics. So here I'll conclude just by saying, inequality in the US has varied across different areas of life. Where equality has been achieved, it's always been contested, always been fragile. And as the experience of Blacks with voting and office holding after the Civil War shows, reversals can and do happen. And right now, I think we're seeing a vicious cycle where, what happens in politics is having an effect on what happens in economics and vice versa, right? The less responsive the government is to popular action, the more apathetic Americans become. And the more apathetic Americans become, the less likely government is to heed public opinion and the more likely it is to follow the preferences of the few. A government that pursues the interests of the few rather than the many is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy, perhaps not in name, but certainly in reality. And I think that's where the country is at the moment. With that, I will end. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Fatovic. Very interesting and very important sort of insights into the ideas of inequality and kind of how it persists in the United States, and I think has resonance in other parts of the world as well. So with that, I will turn it over to our respondent who is here, our discussant, Professor Dayyab Gillani. So he is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Punjab. He has a doctorate in international relations from the University of St. Andrews, a master's also in politics from the University of Warwick. He was visiting faculty at the Lahore School of Economics. He teaches many courses, including Introduction to International Relations, Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, Terrorism and Counterterrorism, which is his specialty. He is also an associate fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK. He has been specially funded on an HEC overseas scholarship, which is a big honor here in Pakistan. And he has many different publications, including a forthcoming chapter from the University of Cambridge, History of Terrorism, and he's also on the National Task Force here in Pakistan, a member of the National Task Force on Counterterrorism. So we're very honored to have Professor Gillani to be the respondent here from Pakistan and to give us his thoughts and comments and perhaps some questions for Professor Fatovic. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Gillani.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Iqbal, for a very generous introduction. And I want to thank Professor Fatovic for a very, very informative lecture. And as you can figure out, this is not exactly my area of expertise. So at best, what I can offer is a layperson's opinion, and in some respects, an outside perspective to this entire topic. And I think when I was preparing for it, one of the things that intrigued me most was, again, why bother with inequality? Why is this notion of inequality? And whenever you talk about the American context or the American discourse in particular, you hear about inequality, you hear about the notion of justice, freedom, liberty, and so on and so forth. I think it's a question that I faced while teaching over here in Pakistan as well, that why do they bother so much with the notions of equality, liberty, justice? Is it just because of political correctness or modern day social and political sensitivities? Or generally, again, the rise of the critical discourse that to an extent compels you to study these liberal values? Or is there actually more to it than meets the eye? And the thing is, again, the more I break it down, and again, I have had this interest, to an extent, limited interest in the American history, and I developed an interest when I briefly taught a course on American foreign policy, and I developed an interest in the American history, and I think in many ways, when you talk about the notion of when you talk about inequality and what America has historically stood for, the two terms somewhat appear to be oxymoron or contradictory. And I say this because, as opposed to perhaps all other countries in the Westphalian order that we live in today, America did not secure its independence at the behest of religion, ethnicity, or any of the national sentiments. Now, the driving force for American freedom is essentially rooted in values and ideals, as opposed to ethnicity, nationality, culture, or other typical determinants of nationhood. Now, these values also happen to be the source of the alleged American identity as well. And I think whenever you talk about the American identity and how it subsequently paved the way for American independence, you have to go back to the time briefly again, you look at the time when it was a colony. And when you look at America as a colony, America was a very unique colony, especially if you try to compare the American experience with other colonies. And again, coming from Pakistan, or if we just look at the subcontinent, the experience is very different. And North America was different, not just in terms of its sheer size or its abundant natural resources, but also in terms of its, and most importantly, in terms of its colonial subjects. Now, the primary subjects were not indigenous people, as we know, indigenous to the region, but were in fact migrants from the very colonizing countries. Great Britain in particular was largely regarded as the parent country of North America. Considering that, again, I think it's a fair question to even ask whether America is can or should be treated as an ordinary colony. And I think, in my reading, and Professor Fatovic could obviously correct me on this, in my reading, I think America also initially did not perceive itself as a colony. And indeed, in many ways, the American people, America was not a stereotypical colony. The colonizers were not subjecting the indigenous population. They were not destroying, reforming their political, social, and cultural structures. So clearly, in many ways, America was no subcontinent, where there was a clear difference between the colonizers and the colonized. And I think this raises the question, who exactly were Americans at the time? And I think it's a very legitimate question to ask as well. Were the North American immigrants at the time, were they colonizers? Were they colonized? Were they Englishmen? Were they Europeans? Were they new Americans? Were they rebels? Were they outcasts? And the thing is, again, it just raises this plethora of questions. And obviously, you could ask, does it really matter? Why do these questions even deserve our attention? And I think, again, when you talk about independence, when you talk about independence movement and how an identity or a certain belief system paved way for independence, these questions are extremely crucial, because the factors that ultimately pave the way for your independence, they have bearing on your national consciousness. They pave the way. They also again mold the way in which you think about the world as well and how you see the world as well. And I think this is again, this tells us a lot about the American people, the American philosophy, and the American ideals as well. And I think when you talk about the Americans realizing or moving or eventually migrating to a point where they realized that they were a colony, it took them some time to actually figure out that they were indeed a colony. And one of the prime reasons why this, and I think in many ways they were also forced to figure it out as well, that they were a colony. And it was because of this increased dissatisfaction with the British overlords, especially in relations, especially in matters related to taxation, the Stamp Act 1965, and then this Townshend Act in 1967, the Tea Act, so on and so forth. So it was, again, I think in many ways it was primarily due to economic disenchantment that instigated the population against their imperial overlords at the time. And I think this entire sentiment is perhaps best captured by Thomas Jefferson, again, one of the most important founding fathers of America at the time. And he famously said, again, and I have his exact quotation, "There is not in the British Empire a man who more cordially loves a union with Great Britain than I do. But by the God that made me, I will cease to exist before I yield to a connection on such terms as the British Parliament propose." And in this, I think I speak the sentiments of America. So it started, we can see that it started off with this economic disenchantment with the British overlords. And it was this economic inequality in many ways that paved the way for Americans to secure independence. But it also, again, jump-started this entire Republican movement as well. And I think this entire Republican movement, or this Republicanism, sums up how the American identity was created in the process as well. Now, when you talk about Republicanism represented more than just a particular form of government, as we typically understand it to be. It was a way of life, a core ideology, an uncompromising commitment to liberty, and a total rejection of aristocracy. And so it was, again, this, when you talk about, and it was this republicanism which became the driving force of the independence movement. And in many ways, once they secured the independence, it was able to manifest itself in the form of Bill of Rights. Now, when you talk about the US Bill of Rights, I think US Bill of Rights incorporates the entire movement. And it was intended, yes, to limit the power of the government and guarantee personal freedom and rights of the individuals. But I think there is more to the Bill of Rights as well. And it's also a good question to ask, why the Bill of Rights was necessary, apart from the fact that, yes, it wanted to ensure the rights of the individual rights of the people. But I think there are important questions that we can ask about the Bill of Rights. What does the Bill of Rights, tell us about the American people? Was it to enforce the idea that the American people are different, to create perhaps a sense of identity revolving around very ideals that spearheaded the American movement? And I think that's what Bill of Rights partly accomplishes as well. Again, what the American people are supposed to be. And it manifested all of that. And in many ways, it is perhaps, again, that one legal document that sort of sums up what the American people stood for. And I think among other things, right, it reiterated that the American people are different, right? They had to justify their independence. The American people, again, it was because it was a very unique colony. They had to justify their independence. They had to justify their migration, and they had to justify the severance of their ties with their ancestral homeland, the British in particular. So to find a purpose in their new homeland, to give meaning and strength to the newly created country, and in many ways to transform their newly found country into a nation, I think it was necessary. And I think that's one of the significances, especially for someone, for an outsider like me, that's what the Bill of Rights partly represents. Now, this newly, again, acquired identity, the American identity enshrined in the Bill of Rights, allowed the Americans to acquire this at that particular time, and in many ways in the modern world today as well, this unique, new, novel identity. It was fundamentally different from the colonial, imperial, aristocratic European snobs, as again, they're often represented or were represented at the time. Unlike their ancestral homes and colonial overlords, America was to be a free country with equal opportunities for all, with basic fundamental rights and freedom guaranteed to all its subjects. And I think, again, that's, again, one of the standing principles of the Bill of Rights. And this is, again, this Bill of Rights that was introduced in, I think, in 1991. It paved the way for a lot of political and intellectual doctrines to emerge as well. One of the most standout among them is perhaps the Manifest Destiny. Again, we see the Manifest Destiny sort of taking place in the 1850s, roughly around that time. And it was basically, again, the idea that the America is not just a country. It's America is a unique country in a certain way because of the way it came about, and again, the driving forces behind American nationalism, the American identity as well. So in many ways, America was a nation with a mission, right? It had a destiny, the destiny of the American settlers to expand across the North American continent and spread the Republican ideals and values enshrined in the Bill of Rights. And this manifest destiny in many ways, I want to reiterate, I'm not trying to make a case for American exceptionalism, as was pointed out by Dr. Fatovic in the beginning as well. But this is just to, again, perhaps show the importance or significance of the notions of inequality, why these notions keep on coming up over and over again. And I think, again, following the manifest destiny, as an outsider, the more I read about the American history, you come across to Wilson's idealism or Wilsonianism. Then you come across Franklin D. Roosevelt's four freedoms. And all of them in one way or another are linked to the Bill of Rights. And again, this American identity and this belief system that Americans are different. And this is what the Americans stand for. And the notions of, again, liberty, equality, freedom, justice, etc. They're not just limited to the American continent, but as a matter of fact, it's a responsibility of the American people to spread it to the rest of the world. And I think after the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, as America gained confidence, it started emerging as one of the most powerful countries in the world. The Bill of Rights, Manifest Destiny, Wilsonianism, FDR freedoms were not just limited to the United States, but were exported to the world at large. Now, why did America have to be active in global politics? Why did it have to lead the world? Was it because it was a superpower? Or was it because, again, simply that it had won war? Did America need to prove something? Or was it simply its destiny? Again, it's just thought-provoking questions that are in one way or another linked essentially to the source of its identity as well. And again, insofar as the American destiny, or again, this vision that these liberal values that America claims to that America aspires for or tends to generally adhere to, right? They can be seen in various presidencies and are asserted by different presidents from time to time as well. So I have, again, I have a collection of some statements by some of the most well-known American presidents. Now, Harry Truman in 1947, he famously stated that the free people of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of our nation. J.F. Kennedy in 1962, he stated, our mission was commissioned by history to be either an observer of freedom's failure or the cause of its success. Ronald Reagan in 1983, he stated that we in this country are by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. George W. Bush Sr. in 1992, he stated, it is the role of the United States to marshal its moral and material resources to promote democratic peace. It is our responsibility to lead. Now, again, this is something that paved the way subsequently for this notion of democratic globalization. And Krautheimer again explains democratic globalization that it is a foreign policy that defines the national interest not as power but as value. And again, it's this value, this driving force, again, this liberty, this notion of equality, justice, freedom, again, that sort of again comes through and has an impact on a global level as well. George Bush Jr. stated after the September 11 attack, he stated that the United States has a mission in the world beyond the balance of power or the simple pursuit of interest. We seek the advancement of freedom and the peace that freedom brings. Now, if we, again, in light of, again, the values that are the determining force behind the American identity, we can see how we can understand communism, or how America responded to communism and terrorism as well. It gets a lot easier for us to understand how they responded. As far as the communists and the alleged terrorist beliefs are concerned, they are diametrically opposed to the American way of life. They're authoritarian, totalitarian, anti-democratic, anti-capitalist, so on and so forth. And they, in many ways, they pose an existential threat to the freedom, liberty, and prosperity of all the world. Or in other words, they posed a threat to the American raison d'etre, what America stands for. Now, to conclude, basically, again, I'll keep it. I'll try to conclude over here. Now, when you talk about the notion of inequality and American identity, and I'll come again, this is something that I said in the beginning as well, that, when you talk about the notion of inequality and American identity, they appear to be oxymoron, or they appear to be contradictory. And one of the reasons, again, being that, again, when you talk about American identity, equality is, again, one of it's supposed to be the driving force behind its identity. And that's one of the reasons why, again, while other nations, again, in Pakistan, we do not have an active discourse or discussion on equality. For America, again, it's a topic that is simply indispensable. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with modern day sensitivities. It also partly has to do with what the country stands for. What is the central driving force behind its identity? And that's that's another reason. And I think in the midst of all these post-structuralist or critical debates, we tend to, again, forget that America genuinely does actually stand for that, even if, again, yes, as Dr. Fatovic identified, that there are a lot of issues of inequality in the United States, not just, again, in terms of economic inequality, but also a significant racial inequality as well. But it's just that, again, these questions are indispensable for the American population at large, for the American both public and academic discourse as well. The burden to uphold equality and the dictates of republicanism are all the more critical for the US, since they are the sole source of the country's alleged identity. So there is a lot at stake. To prevent a potential identity crisis or simply live up to the ideals of the founding fathers, it is necessary to address any standing ambiguities regarding all forms of inequality. And in conclusion, I agree with Professor Fatovic. Again, I could not, again, get my hands on his book, but I managed to get some book reviews. So again, he can correct me if I'm wrong. But again, from what I've read, I agree with Professor Fatovic's normative standpoint that while the intent of the founding fathers on various social and political matters is somewhat mixed, often dubious, and at times even hypocritical, especially in relation to women, racial and economic rights, the question becomes how we ought to read the intent, and how do we make it more contextually relevant. And then again, I'll conclude here. And again, I would say this again, I'm not an expert on the subject. I just wanted to offer, again, a layperson or an outside perspective on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gillani. That was exceptional insight and a great perspective from Pakistan as well. So I'll just turn it over to Professor Fatovic just for a quick response, and then we can just open it up for some questions.
Thank you very much for those comments and suggestions, Dr. Gillani. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm not going to be able to respond to every point you made because there was so much rich material there. So I'll try to tie everything together as much as I can and hit the main points. So in terms of the origins of American identity, I think like any other identity, it's a complex issue in a sense. To the extent the American identity rests on certain abstract principles, like the principles of freedom or equality, those are essentially overdetermined. And what I mean by that is that American understandings of these ideals were shaped both by British experience. So if you look at the initial resistance to some of the parliamentary laws that you mentioned, the Townshend Acts, the Stamp Act, et cetera, initially the opposition was grounded in terms of the perceived violation of these parliamentary laws to established English constitutional practices. So English history, particularly constitutional history, was an important source for understandings of colonial identity and belief systems. And an important part of that was also the idea of equality under the law, right? This is something that goes back to Magna Carta, which is, of course, is a document created for aristocrats, but would end up having a larger sort of purchase for others. If you look at the English Civil War, 1642 to 1660, more or less, there was a large debate that took place at the time over some of the issues that would occupy Americans during the Revolution, and there you saw parliamentary forces or supporters of Parliament endorsing the idea of equality under the law and equal rights, legal rights. And I mentioned this only to sort of say that's an important part of their thinking. Another important source for thinking about the abstract ideas of equality and freedom would also be Protestantism, where several denominations of Protestantism understood themselves as directly in opposition to the more sort of hierarchical and rigid practices and institutions that existed in Catholicism, where there's a greater sort of degree of openness and a greater premium placed on equality in some of these Protestant denominations. Again, most overwhelmingly, American colonists were Protestant. Again, there were exceptions there. And I would say a third important source of thinking about this, which of course then becomes part of the American identity, are these political philosophical texts. Most importantly, John Locke's works, not just the true treatises of government, which got a lot of attention and are often assigned to courses, but also his Letter Concerning Toleration and his philosophical tome, The Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is actually widely read and admired by clergymen of all people because of its connection to providing a rational account for Christianity. Now, all that said, there are different sources for thinking about the idea of equality, some more philosophical, some religious, some more historical and constitutional. And by the time you get to the point where Americans are ready to break with Great Britain, their arguments were increasingly relying on abstract liberal and Republican ideals. So Locke and also those thinkers that are identified as being part of the Commonwealth tradition, the Republican thinkers who opposed royalist forces during the English Civil War of the previous century. And as Americans increasingly came to rest their arguments against Great Britain and to develop their arguments in terms of natural rights thinking, their commitment to equality became more universalistic. It was no longer just about what Englishmen are owed. It wasn't just about what rights Englishmen possess, but what human beings as such possess. So once you see this turn to a more kind of universalistic understanding of rights, freedom, and equality, that ends up taking on a life of its own. And again, the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson himself later insisted was not a unique statement on his part, but was a reflection of general American ideas, that he was basically just speaking the American mind is the terminology he used, right? This was a set of ideas that would become kind of the bedrock principles of the American identity that Dr. Gillani mentioned. Now, when it comes to how that idea has been promoted, promulgated, or deployed in America's relationships with other parts of the world, what you see is that this universalistic idea, like any universalistic idea, is always structured by and is sometimes in the service of particularistic ends and intentions. And what I mean by that is that often what the promotion of supposedly universalistic ideals means is becoming more American. In other words, the idea of equality has a peculiarly idiosyncratically American focus. The idea of freedom ends up having a very kind of American structure and tone to it. And so when, whether it's Ronald Reagan or Woodrow Wilson, promoting these ideals and saying America has a kind of a normative moral mission in the world. It's not just a matter of realpolitik, but it's about, serving, promoting these high-minded ideals. Those ideals are always ideals that look very American, right? And so freedom ends up meaning something like a form of capitalism, right? Rights mean the kinds of rights that are enjoyed by Americans. So the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, right, which gets promulgated after World War II, has a whole list of rights that belong to all of us by virtue of our humanity. There are rights in there that are not recognized or enshrined in any American or US documents. For instance, the right to form a family, the right to protection of one's culture. Those have never been an important part of American understandings of these supposedly universal rights. Right? When America promotes ideals of human rights abroad or promotes the idea of equality, it's typically these American ideals or what matters to Americans, not these ideas that were promoted and put in the UN Declaration by representatives from other countries around the world. When it comes to trying to think of what else I can address. This idea of equality and its role in the world today. Again, there are a lot of reasons it gets sustained. And I think you're right that one of the things that does make the United States different from many other places is that its self-identity is rooted in a set of ideas. As I've suggested, those ideas change over time. They're not, fixed and frozen. They're somewhat fluid. But that said, there are direct challenges to those ideals today. They may not be huge challenges or, challenges that are endorsed by sizable portions of the community. But if you look at the rhetoric that has been a part of American discourse over the last few years, particularly in the run-up to the 2016 election and throughout the last few years, various versions of white nationalism have competed against, right, America, these Jeffersonian ideas of equality for supremacy, right? And there are important figures, some of whom ended up working in the Trump administration, who actively promoted versions of white nationalism or the idea of Christian nationalism as an alternative, right? And those are very particularistic ideas, right? And those are rejections of this idea that, the US is a place for anyone, right? I didn't talk about immigration all that much, but one of the reasons the US has been an appealing place for many people is that the rhetoric is that it's a place that welcomes everyone, right? That's not always the reality, but at least that's the selling point. There have been figures recently who have argued that America should be for Christians and for whites. And sometimes that was made quite explicit by some members of the Trump administration. And sometimes it was a little bit more carefully couched in, language where, you didn't have to read too much between the lines to know what was going on. Now, there was a comment in the chat. I appreciate this comment about Native Americans, who I wanted to include, but again, in the interest of time, I unfortunately had to leave a lot out. All I can say about Native Americans and their connection to Blacks is that both faced many forms of discrimination. Both were understood in highly racialized terms, but there were important differences between the treatment of Blacks and whites. And some of this goes back to the question of the colonial experience that Dr. Gillani asked me about. So, during the so-called colonial period, for much of its history, now I'm talking about the end of the 17th century up to the time that the tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain emerged. This is basically described as a period of benign neglect where, yes, the US was, or America was under the protection of the British Navy in particular, but for the most part, Americans were able to live more or less freely. In other words, to practice forms of self-governance. Yes, they needed approval from Parliament to pass certain laws, but they were able to enjoy a considerable degree of latitude and independence that was not necessarily enjoyed by British subjects in other places. What they did need Great Britain for was military protection against two major threats. One was Spanish and French sources. So the British were the largest settlers and then along the Atlantic seaboard, but they were, of course, French, British, and other settlers. And occasionally there would be skirmishes and tensions between British subjects and subjects of other European powers. But the other reason that Americans welcomed British involvement during this period was because they often needed the British military, especially in forts along the so-called frontier, to fight Native Americans. And this gets me to the question of the chat. The chief policy of Americans, both in this period and then once the country gets established after the Constitution, is a policy of forced removal. There were a number of treaties that were established. Many of them would get abrogated, just sort of avoided by Americans. But the policy towards Native Americans was to forcibly relocate them. Whenever they stood in the way of progress, which basically meant the ability of white settlers to move into a place, they were forced out, right? I mean, literally forced out either by state forces or, as in the example of Andrew Jackson, with the approval and support of the national government, right? And so rather than using the labor of Native Americans to serve various economic interests, right? The chief object that Native Americans had that Americans wanted was land, right? The chief good that Blacks could provide was the labor of their own bodies. And Americans throughout the 18th and into the 19th centuries treated each group with those interests in mind.
Thank you.
I think other questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Professor Fatovic. Professor Gillani, do you have any response or do you have any ideas? We can't hear you. I think you're on mute, yeah. Professor Gillani, you need to unmute.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes. Yes, I know we are constrained against time, and but I just had one small question, and if we have time for that, Professor Fatovic, you mentioned that the idea that American identity is rooted, American identity is not necessarily static, and that it tends to be fluid and it tends to change with time. And I just have a question regarding this. What exactly, again, in terms of, again, when you talk about the American identity, and again, when you talk about the determining factors, and if you say that, some of these values and ideas that they're not static, what exactly is the implication of that? And what exactly it is about these elements that are not necessarily static? Is it the nature of freedom itself that tends to evolve? Is it the notion of equality that tends to evolve? Is that what you're referring to, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, no, thank you. So to clarify, the terms are fixed, but the meaning is what changes over time. In other words, there's a difference between terminology and conceptualization, right? So the terms equality and freedom and democracy, which, and by the way, democracy itself was not a positive term until the 19th century. So that's also a significant change, right? One of the important changes that took place, say, between the revolutionary period and even into the creation of the Constitution, is that democracy was a pejorative term, ends up becoming a positive term, by the second, third decade of the 19th century. So that's a change. But in terms of freedom and equality, the change is in terms of how these ideas are understood and to whom they're applied. So that's some of what I tried to address in my talk. So the eventual extension of equality and freedom to women, obviously imperfectly, but the idea that the gendered language of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created, actually means all individuals are created equal. That's something that was not immediately recognized to Americans. It took a long time for the United States to get to that point. And then there was a whole debate in the 1820s and actually from the 1830s on, where you saw Southern slaveholders actually make the argument that no, the Declaration of Independence could not possibly have included Blacks. That even though it says all men are created equal, implied in that was white men. Where, I mean, that it wasn't, they they basically just sort of wrote their own prejudices and biases into the wording of a document that gave no indication that it was restricted in those ways. And again, there was the wrestling between supporters of slavery and opponents of slavery about things like the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and also what equality means. So figures such as Frederick Douglass, for instance, a former self-emancipated slave, became an important figure, right? Are engaged in a long debate with slaveholders and slave supporters about the meaning of equality, the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, and its central role in the American identity and in the American experience more generally. And then you see the same sort of reference to the Declaration of Independence and that claim of equality being used by the first wave of feminism in the United States, where Susan B. Anthony and others would basically revise the Declaration of Independence and put out these new statements that basically just added women. So they basically copied almost word for word huge portions of the Declaration of Independence in their own resolutions and statements, and they would say all men and women are created equal, to make explicit what they thought should have been understood all along. But they were still basically grounding their claims in these universalistic ideas, right? The argument wasn't that this is part of the American experience, that this is something that is, demanded by, nature. And for some thinkers, this was more explicitly rooted in a very particular Protestant kind of notion of the divine. For others, it was a little bit more secular.
Great. So I just see if there are any more questions. There don't seem to be any more. Professor Fatovic, Professor Gillani, if you maybe want to say like a very quick closing statement. If there's something that you would like to say, or you think there should be more research on, or any ideas that came as you were thinking about these topics.
I think if I may be allowed to just say one last thing, I think there's just this general perception, and I think Dr. Fatovic also mentioned this, that ordinary Americans, that there's this prevailing misperception that ordinary Americans do not care about inequality. And I think I do agree with him, especially when you talk about the academic discourse, this debate about inequality in America, it's very intense. And there are a lot of academics like Professor Fatovic who have raised this issue. And I think there is more that needs to be done in terms of addressing this misperception, because there's this, to an extent, limited. Perhaps there is some prevailing perception over here as well, owing primarily to racial inequality and the things that you tend to see on television, that perhaps the American, or again, the rise of this right-wing extremism. You do hear about the fact that a lot of people in America, perhaps they don't care about inequality as much, but I think that is misleading, and but more needs to be done in terms of, again, presenting this to the wider audience, that the American people are concerned, and the academics in particular are extremely concerned about the notion of inequality and what that entails in the United States and beyond.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Gillani, and Professor Fatovic. If you want to say, yeah.
I think Dr. Gillani raised some very important questions about colonial experiences. I know there's some work on this. This is not exactly where the kind of work I do or that I've done to this point, but I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at the way, essentially from looking at America in a comparative perspective. Some of this it has been done recently when it comes to questions about populism and right-wing authoritarianism. Some scholars have suggested that maybe it's time scholars in the United States actually look at the United States not as this sort of unique nation, but as a country that goes through some of the same sorts of issues, follows some of the same patterns as others. And I think it might be interesting and valuable to look at how the U.S. colonial experience is similar to and differs from that of not just other British colonies, but other colonies and colonial experiences around the world. So I would, basically I'm copying Dr. Gillani's suggestion and saying it's a good one to pursue.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you both for taking the time to talk and for helping to, develop the connections in terms of thinking about these important, political science, IR, and sort of even American historical questions. So just to briefly let you know, tomorrow's lecture then is going to be on Hinduism. So we're going to be starting our religious studies sort of section with Professor Anjana Mishra and also Ms. Masuma Sabzawari from UMT. So thank you again for taking the time to talk, Professor Fatovic, Professor Gillani, for an extremely stimulating conversation. And hopefully, eventually we can have these conversations in person at some point. Professor Fatovic can come join us in Pakistan, or you guys can come to the United States. But thank you so much for taking the time to come. And I wish you a good night or a good morning wherever you are. Take care. Bye.